The subway car rattled along the tracks, its fluorescent lights flickering faintly as passengers clutched their bags and phones, avoiding each other's eyes. It was one of those rides where everyone was in their own bubble, trying to get through another day in the city. But then something happened that pulled everyone out of their silent routines. A man's booming voice cut through the hum of the train. He stood near the center, towering over a young girl who sat hunched on the seat, her face flushed with embarrassment. "You think I'm playing with you?" he barked, his words sharp and heavy with frustration. The girl, no older than 14, kept her head down, her small hands gripping the edges of her backpack. She didn't say a word, but her silence spoke volumes. It was the kind of silence that made you feel the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. The man continued, his voice rising with every sentence. "You wanna act like a grown-up? Fine. But you're gonna face the consequences. Everyone here should know how you've been disrespecting me." His words echoed in the confined space, and the other passengers began to glance at each other, their discomfort growing. Some shifted in their seats, pretending not to notice, while others stared, caught between curiosity and unease. Among the crowd was a man in his early 30s, dressed casually in jeans and a simple jacket. His posture was relaxed, but his sharp eyes took in every detail of the unfolding scene. He was a Marine, though you wouldn't know it just by looking at him. Years of discipline and service had taught him to observe, to assess, and to act when the moment called for it. And right now, his instincts were on high alert. The father's words became harsher, his tone angrier as he gestured wildly. "Maybe this will teach you to listen," he said, grabbing the girl's phone and holding it up for everyone to see. The girl flinched, her shoulders trembling as she tried to make herself smaller, to disappear. The Marine clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists. He'd seen situations like this before, situations where someone in a position of power used it to belittle someone else. And every fiber of his being told him this wasn't right. But what could he do? This was a family matter, wasn't it? He didn't know the full story. Maybe the father had his reasons. Still, the sight of the girl's tear-streaked face and the sound of her muffled sniffles gnawed at him. The other passengers remained frozen, their discomfort palpable, but their inaction louder than words. It was as if they were all waiting for someone else to step in, someone else to break the tension. The Marine's mind raced. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He'd been trained to face danger, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. But this wasn't a battlefield. It was a subway car filled with strangers. Yet, in that moment, he realized something. Courage isn't just about charging into gunfire or risking your life in a war zone. Sometimes it's about standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you're not sure how it will end. As the father continued his tirade, the Marine took a deep breath, his decision made. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, drawing the attention of the passengers around him. The father turned, his angry eyes meeting the Marine's calm, steady gaze. For a moment, the subway car fell silent, the tension crackling like static electricity. The subway car felt like it had been plunged into an eerie silence, the kind that makes your heart race without you knowing why. All eyes were on the Marine now, his presence commanding without him needing to say a word. He stood tall, his gaze locked on the father. For a moment the father hesitated, his grip on the phone tightening. The Marine didn't flinch. He wasn't confrontational, but there was a quiet strength in the way he carried himself. The girl, still sitting on the seat, looked up for the first time. Her tear-filled eyes darted between the two men, unsure of what was about to happen. She didn't know who this stranger was or why he had decided to stand up. Maybe part of her hoped he'd intervene, but another part seemed terrified of what might happen if he did. The father broke the silence, his voice tinged with irritation and defensiveness. "What's your problem, man? This is my kid. Stay out of it." His words were sharp, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his tone, like he wasn't used to being challenged in public. The Marine didn't respond right away. He studied the man carefully, as if weighing his words before speaking. Finally, he said, "I don't mean to interfere, but I think you've made your point." His voice was calm, steady, and firm a tone that suggested he wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't going to back down either. The father narrowed his eyes, clearly not expecting this. "You don't know what she's done?" he snapped, gesturing toward the girl. "She needs to learn respect. Kids these days think they can do whatever they want." The Marine nodded slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe so," he said. "But there's a way to teach respect without breaking someone's spirit." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The father looked around, noticing the other passengers watching. Some were staring openly now, while others tried to pretend they weren't listening. The pressure of the moment seemed to weigh on him. He shifted his stance, his bravado faltering just a little. "This is none of your business," he muttered, his voice lower now. The Marine didn't budge. "Maybe not," he said. "But when you're in a public space, it becomes everyone's business. Especially when it involves a child." The girl's cheeks flushed, and she looked down again, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her backpack. The Marine noticed but didn't draw attention to her. Instead, he kept his focus on the father, his tone softening just enough to show he wasn't trying to escalate the situation. "I get that parenting is hard," the Marine said. "I'm not here to judge you. But right now, she's scared. And I don't think that's the lesson you want her to remember." The father opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, clearly unsure of what to say. The tension in the subway car was thick, the air heavy with unspoken emotions. The other passengers waited, their eyes darting between the two men like they were watching a scene from a movie. Finally, the father let out a frustrated sigh. He shoved the phone back into the girl's hands and muttered something under his breath. Then, without another word, he turned and moved to the other end of the car, leaning against the door with his arms crossed. The girl sat frozen, clutching her phone tightly. The Marine glanced at her, his expression softening. He crouched down slightly so he was at her eye level. "You okay?" he asked gently. She nodded quickly, though her eyes were still glassy with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the train. The Marine gave her a small nod, then returned to his seat. The subway car gradually came back to life, the other passengers returning to their own worlds, though a few stole glances at the Marine, their expressions a mix of admiration and curiosity. As the train pulled into the next station, the Marine glanced at his watch. He had somewhere to be, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment wasn't over yet. There was something about the girl's haunted expression that stayed with him, a quiet plea for help that went beyond what had just happened. When the door slid open, the father motioned for the girl to follow him. She hesitated for a split second, her eyes flickering toward the Marine, before she got up and trailed after her father. The Marine watched them leave, his instincts telling him there was more to this story than met the eye. As the doors closed and the train began to move again, he found himself staring at the empty seat where the girl had been sitting. He couldn't explain it, but something about the encounter felt unfinished. He didn't know her name, her story, or what would happen next. But one thing was clear, this wasn't just another subway ride. The Marine leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. He had no idea that this small act of standing up would set off a chain of events that would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone involved. The Marine couldn't shake the image of the girl from his mind. Even as the subway rattled onto the next station, he replayed the scene over and over, wondering if he'd done enough. There was something in her eyes, a mix of fear, exhaustion, and a faint glimmer of hope that left him unsettled. He had learned to trust his instincts during his years of service, and they were telling him loud and clear that this wasn't the end of the story. When the train reached his stop, he stepped off but found himself scanning the platform, half hoping and half dreading that he might see the girl and her father again. They were gone, swallowed up by the busy city. He stood there for a moment, feeling a strange pull, like he was supposed to do something more. But what? He didn't even know their names. As he walked toward the street, he noticed a small piece of paper on the ground near the bench where the father and daughter had waited. It was crumpled, and the handwriting was messy, but he recognized the faint imprint of a school logo at the top. His heart skipped a beat. He picked it up, smoothing it out carefully. It was a homework assignment, likely hers, and the name in the top corner was barely legible. Emily. He stared at the paper, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but the simple fact that she had dropped it felt like a sign. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but it felt like a thread he needed to pull. He slipped the paper into his pocket and decided to start asking questions. The next day, he made his way to the school listed on the paper. It was a modest brick building nestled between towering apartment complexes. He hesitated for a moment outside the gates, wondering if he was overstepping. But then he thought of Emily's tear-streaked face and the way she had clutched her backpack like it was the only thing grounding her. If there was even a chance that she needed help, he had to try. Inside, the front office was bustling with activity. A receptionist glanced up as he walked in. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but distracted. He nodded, choosing his words carefully. I found this on the subway," he said, pulling the crumpled paper from his pocket. "I think it belongs to a student here. Emily, Lily." He paused, watching her reaction. The receptionist's brow furrowed as she looked at the paper. "Emily?" she repeated, as if trying to place the name. "We have a few students with that name." "Do you know her last name?" The Marine shook his head. "No, just Emily. I saw her on the train yesterday. She seemed upset. I wanted to make sure she's okay." The receptionist studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "Let me see what I can do," she said. Wait here. Minutes felt like hours as he stood in the small office, his mind racing with possibilities. When the receptionist returned, her face was tight with concern. "I think I know who you're talking about," she said quietly. "Emily didn't show up to school today. She's been missing a lot of days lately." His chest tightened. "Do you know if something's going on at home?" he asked carefully, not wanting to overstep but feeling the urgency of the situation. The receptionist hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "There have been rumors," she admitted in a low voice, "but nothing confirmed. We've reached out to her father, but he's not very cooperative. It's a delicate situation." The Marine thanked her and left the office, his mind spinning. He couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was in trouble. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but there were still too many unanswered questions. He decided to head back to the subway station where he had first seen her, hoping for a stroke of luck. Hours passed as he lingered near the platform, watching the ebb and flow of passengers. Just as he was about to give up, he spotted a familiar figure. Emily's father was standing near the turnstiles, his expression tense as he spoke angrily into his phone. The Marine's heart raced. He scanned the area but didn't see Emily. Where was she? He stayed out of sight, watching as the father paced back and forth. The man's body language was agitated, his voice loud enough to catch snippets of his conversation. "I told you I'm handling it," he barked into the phone. "She's not going anywhere. Don't you dare show up at my door." The Marine's stomach churned. Whoever he was talking to, it was clear there was more going on than a simple family dispute. He decided to follow him, keeping a safe distance as the man left the station and headed down a side street. The farther they walked, the quieter the neighborhood became. It was the kind of area where people kept their curtains drawn and didn't ask too many questions. The Marine stayed in the shadows, his instincts on high alert. Finally, the father turned into a rundown apartment building and disappeared inside. The Marine hesitated, weighing his options. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but every instinct told him that Emily needed help. He approached the building slowly, scanning for any sign of her. Through a second-floor window, he thought he saw a flicker of movement, a small silhouette passing by. He felt a surge of determination. He didn't know exactly what he was walking into, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that he was running out of time. As he reached for the buzzer, he realized he had no plan. All he had was the conviction that doing nothing wasn't an option. The Marine hesitated with his hand hovering over the buzzer. He knew this wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It was a gut feeling, the kind he'd learned to trust in the field. But this wasn't a battlefield, and there was no protocol for stepping into someone else's life like this. Still, he couldn't ignore the urgency in his chest. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the button labeled with the apartment number he'd seen the father enter. For a moment, there was nothing but static from the intercom. Then a gruff voice crackled through. "Who is it?" The Marine kept his tone calm, masking the tension in his voice. "Delivery," he said, improvising. There was a pause, followed by a buzz as the door unlocked. He stepped inside, his boots echoing on the worn linoleum floor. The building smelled of mildew and faint traces of cigarette smoke, and the dim lighting cast long shadows down the narrow hallway. As he climbed the stairs, he could hear muffled voices coming from the second floor. When he reached the door, he paused again, listening carefully. The father's voice was unmistakable, but there was another voice now hushed, frantic, and unfamiliar. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was enough to set him on edge. He knocked firmly, keeping his stance neutral but ready. The voices inside stopped abruptly. After a few seconds, the door creaked open, and the father stood there, his expression a mix of surprise and suspicion. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone defensive. The Marine glanced past him into the apartment. It was small and cluttered, with dishes piled in the sink and clothes strewn across the furniture. There was no sign of Emily. "I found something that might belong to your daughter," the Marine said, pulling the crumpled paper from his pocket. He kept his voice steady, watching the father's reaction closely. The man's eyes flickered to the paper, then back to the Marine. "Thanks," he said curtly, reaching for it. But the Marine didn't let go right away. "Is she here?" he asked, his tone casual but pointed. The father's jaw tightened. "She's fine," he said, his voice clipped. "Now, if you don't mind." Before he could finish, there was a sudden noise from deeper inside the apartment, a faint thud, followed by a muffled cry. The Marine's eyes narrowed, and his grip on the paper tightened. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of tension. The father stepped in front of the door, blocking the Marine's view. "I said she's fine," he snapped. "You need to leave." But the Marine wasn't going anywhere. His instincts were screaming now, every fiber of his being telling him that something was very wrong. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on the father's. "I'd like to see for myself," he said, his voice low and steady. The father's face darkened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might lash out. But then the Marine heard it again, a faint, desperate sound coming from behind the closed door, what looked like a bedroom. He didn't wait for permission. Pushing past the father, he moved toward the sound, his heart pounding. The father shouted in protest, but the Marine ignored him, his focus laser sharp. When he reached the door, he tried the handle, but it was locked. Without hesitation, he stepped back and kicked it open, the wood splintering under the force. Inside, the room was dimly lit, and the sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. Emily was sitting on the floor, her hands tied with a frayed piece of rope. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with fear. Standing over her was a man the Marine didn't recognize, a wiry figure with a nervous energy that made him seem unpredictable. The man froze, his eyes darting between Emily and the Marine. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice shaky but defiant. The Marine didn't answer. His training kicked in, his body moving on instinct as he stepped into the room, placing himself between Emily and the stranger. "Let her go," he said, his voice calm but firm. The man hesitated, glancing toward the window as if considering an escape. But before he could make a move, the father appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of anger and panic. "What are you doing?" the father shouted, his voice cracking. The Marine turned to him, his eyes blazing. "You tell me," he said, his tone sharp. "What's going on here?" the father stammered, his bravado crumbling under the Marine's piercing gaze. "It's not what it looks like," he said, his voice faltering. But the Marine wasn't buying it. He turned back to Emily, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. She nodded shakily, her eyes brimming with tears. I don't know what's happening, she whispered. The tension in the room was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken truths. The Marine could feel the situation spiraling, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't leaving without Emily. As he positioned himself to protect her, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever was happening here, it was deeper and darker than he'd imagined. And he was about to find out just how far some people would go to keep their secrets hidden. The Marine didn't take his eyes off the man standing over Emily. His instinct screamed danger, but his focus remained razor sharp. "Step away from her," he said again, his voice low and commanding. The man hesitated, his gaze darting between the Marine and the open window. His nervous energy betrayed his fear, but there was something calculating in the way he shifted his weight, like he was trying to decide whether to fight or flee. Emily whimpered, her small frame trembling as she looked between the Marine and her captor. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. That single word was enough to ignite the Marine's resolve. He took a step forward, his presence filling the room like a storm. The man backed up slightly, raising his hands in a defensive gesture. Okay, the man stammered, his voice shaky. "No one needs to get hurt." The father, still standing in the doorway, suddenly snapped. "You idiot," he shouted at the man. "Why didn't you just keep her quiet?" The Marine froze, his mind racing to process what he'd just heard. He turned to the father, his expression a mix of disbelief and fury. "What did you just say?" The father's face twisted in anger and desperation. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "I had no choice. She was going to ruin everything." Emily's eyes widened in terror, and she shook her head vehemently. "No, that's not true," she cried. The Marine stepped between them, his protective instincts kicking into overdrive. "You're going to explain?" he said, his tone ice cold. "Right now." The father's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, he looked like a man who had finally run out of options. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "She found out. About the money. About the people I owe." The Marine's stomach turned as the pieces began to fall into place. "You're in debt," he said, his voice flat. "And you thought using your daughter would fix it?" The father's silence was answer enough. The man by the window seized the moment of distraction, lunging toward the door. But the Marine was faster. In a blur of movement, he intercepted him, pinning him against the wall with a force that left no room for resistance. "You're not going anywhere," the Marine growled, his voice like steel. The man whimpered, his bravado evaporating under the Marine's unrelenting grip. "It wasn't my idea," he blurted out. "I was just supposed to keep an eye on her until they came to collect." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Emily let out a small gasp, her eyes filling with tears. The Marine turned back to the father, his expression a mask of controlled fury. "You sold her out," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "To save yourself." The father opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. His guilt was written all over his face. Before the Marine could say anything else, the sound of sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Relief washed over him. He'd called for backup the moment he'd stepped into the building, just in case. When the police arrived moments later, the scene unfolded quickly. The man by the window was handcuffed and led away, his protest drowned out by the officer's commands. The father tried to plead his case, but the officers weren't interested. Emily clung to the Marine, her small hands gripping his sleeve like a lifeline. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. He crouched down to her level, his expression softening. "You're safe now," he said gently. "No one's going to hurt you again." As the officers escorted the father out of the apartment, Emily looked up at the Marine, her tear-streaked face filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. "What's going to happen to me?" she asked quietly. The Marine's heart ached at the question. "We'll figure it out," he said. "But you're not alone anymore." "I promise." Just as the tension in the room began to dissipate, one of the officers approached the Marine, holding a small envelope. "We found this in the father's jacket," he said, handing it over. The Marine opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. Inside was a list of names and addresses, along with a significant amount of cash. At the bottom of the list was Emily's name, circled in red. His blood ran cold. This wasn't just about debt, it was something much bigger. As he looked down at Emily, he realized that this was far from over. The father might have been desperate, but someone else had been pulling the strings. And whoever they weren't going to stop just because one man had been caught. The Marine stood, his jaw set with determination. He'd gotten Emily out of immediate danger, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The Marine stared at the list in his hand, his mind racing. Emily's name circled in red was more than just a chilling detail, it was a warning. Whoever was behind this wouldn't stop, not even with her father and his accomplice out of the picture. He tucked the envelope into his pocket and turned to Emily, who was still clutching his sleeve, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "It's going to be okay," he said softly, crouching down to meet her gaze. "You're safe now, and I'm going to make sure it stays that way." Emily nodded, but the weight of everything she'd been through was evident in her trembling frame. The Marine gently placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before rising to speak with the officers. He explained what he'd found and urged them to dig deeper into the names on the list. The officers exchanged grim looks, promising to investigate further. One officer, a seasoned detective with a weary expression, pulled the Marine aside. "You've done a lot already," he said. "But this is dangerous territory. These people don't play by the rules." The Marine's jaw tightened. "Neither do I when it comes to protecting kids," he replied. "Just keep her safe while I figure this out." The detective nodded, clearly recognizing the determination in his tone. "We'll take her to Child Services. They'll find her a safe place." The Marine hesitated, glancing back at Emily. The idea of leaving her in a system that might fail her didn't sit right. But he knew she needed stability, and for now, this was the best option. He knelt beside her again, his voice gentle but firm. "You're going to go with these officers for a little while," he said. "They'll take care of you. But I'll check on you soon, okay?" Emily looked at him with a mixture of trust and uncertainty. "Promise?" she whispered. He nodded. "I promise." As the officers led Emily away, the Marine felt a pang of guilt and resolve. He had done what he could to keep her safe, but there was still work to be done. The list in his pocket was a lead, and he wasn't about to let it go cold. Over the next few days, he dove headfirst into the investigation. He used every resource he had, contacts from his time in the service, local community networks, and even anonymous tips through online forums. The names on the list led him to a network of individuals involved in shady dealings, all connected to a larger criminal enterprise. It became clear that Emily's father had been a small player in a much bigger game, and his debts had put her in the crosshairs of dangerous people. One name on the list stood out, a man known only by the alias Kane. He was rumored to be the mastermind behind the operation, a shadowy figure who stayed several steps ahead of the law. The Marine knew that finding Kane was the key to dismantling the network and ensuring Emily's safety once and for all. His search eventually led him to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place whispered about in the circles he'd been digging into. It was there that Kane was rumored to conduct his business, far from prying eyes. The Marine prepared carefully, knowing this confrontation could go sideways in an instant. When he arrived at the warehouse, the atmosphere was tense, the air heavy with the scent of oil and rust. He moved quietly, his senses heightened as he navigated the maze of crates and machinery. Voices echoed from deeper inside, and he followed them, his pulse steady but quick. As he rounded a corner, he saw them, a group of men huddled around a table, discussing plans he couldn't quite make out. At the center was a tall, imposing figure who could only be Kane. The Marine took a deep breath, readying himself for what was to come. Before he could make his move, one of the men spotted him. Hey, who's there?" the man shouted, drawing the attention of the group. The Marine stepped into the open, his posture calm but commanding. "I'm here to talk to Kane," he said, his voice steady. Kane smirked, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the intruder. "And who are you?" he asked, his tone mocking. "Someone who's not afraid of you," the Marine replied, his gaze unwavering. The room grew tense as the men around Kane shifted, their hands inching toward concealed weapons. But Kane held up a hand, signaling them to stop. "You've got guts," he said. "I'll give you that. But you're in way over your head." The Marine took a step closer, his voice firm. "I know what you've been doing. I know about the kids you've been targeting. And I'm here to make sure it stops." Kane's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "You think you can take me down?" he asked. "You're just one man. One man is all it takes," the Marine said, his voice like steel. What followed was a tense standoff, words exchanged like blows, as the Marine confronted Kane with everything he'd uncovered. The tension reached a boiling point when one of Kane's men lost patience and lunged forward. The Marine reacted instantly, disarming the attacker and turning the tide in his favor. The chaos that erupted was swift and brutal, but the Marine's training and determination carried him through. By the time the dust settled, Kane and his men were subdued, and the authorities, alerted by a call the Marine had made earlier, arrived to take them into custody. In the days that followed, the network was dismantled, and those involved faced justice. Emily was placed with a caring foster family, and the Marine kept his promise to check on her. When he visited, her face lit up with a smile that made all the sacrifices worth it. As he said goodbye to her one last time, she hugged him tightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. He smiled, his heart full. "You're going to do great things, Emily," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Walking away, the Marine felt a sense of closure. He had done what he set out to do, not just to protect Emily, but to stand against the kind of darkness that preys on the vulnerable. It wasn't the kind of victory that came with medals or parades, but it was one that mattered deeply. And as he disappeared into the bustling city streets, he knew that sometimes doing the right thing was its own reward.